Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Shining Fates, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code Omnipoke. It's finally time for the Battle Styles set review. Jack is here alongside me, and today we're going to be going over the trainer cards from Battle Styles. We're going to be splitting the set review up into 3 parts, mostly because Battle Styles is just so stacked that we're going to end up spending maybe around an hour on each of these segments, so hopefully it's going to be more digestible for everyone. So let's jump straight into it.
Yeah, and as usual, we have the sort of rating systems back. Once again, we're rating based on current standard. Feel free to pause here just so you can see a little bit more of an in-depth guide as to what we're rating out of 5. And again, we've asked the community, asked you guys for some extra insight in what you think about some of these cards. So if you take a look up at the top corner next to our rating, you'll also see a little pie chart so you can get an idea of what the community sort of think about some of these cards as well. Make sure you keep an eye out for these. We do these before every single set review, so make sure you keep an eye out just to get involved next time. But for now, I think we're kicking things off with Billowing Fan.
Yeah, Billowing Fan is a new Rapid Strike item. As I'm sure you guys are all aware, there are Rapid Strike and Single Strike cards coming out in Battle Styles, and typically there's some upside to having these sorts of tags. They can be searchable, which is the case for Rapid Strike cards through an Octillery that we'll look at later on in another video. But essentially, this is just a regular item card with a bit of upside in that it could be searchable through this one effect of Octillery. The card itself reads, return a special energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon to the bottom of your opponent's deck. So it's a very similar effect to Enhanced Hammer, but it's also kind of mixing in that Yell Grunt factor where it's just a tempo removal rather than actually hurting your opponent's resources. I think this is a good direction, seeing as though we've seen how effective control has been in the past. So from a game design standpoint, I'm much happier seeing tempo removal rather than just straight hard removal as an E-Hammer. And I think even though this does have that Rapid Strike tag, I can foresee this card going into a ton of different archetypes, just because we've seen how strong Crushing Hammers have been, and even Pikachu and Zekrom, they've gone down the Team Yell Grunt route as of late, definitely, as this meta's developed. And that could really give you an indication that having an item version of this effect could just be very, very solid. There's a ton of archetypes in the game currently that are using special energy, and there's also a couple of very impressive special energy in the set as well, and plenty of reason for specials to still be in the format. That Billowing Fan could get a lot of value, even in non-Rapid Strike decks, like I keep saying. The Picarom's out there. Eternatus has played Drill in the past and could play something similar here with an effect that, doesn't force a discard from you and doesn't have to be a combination kind of thing. Lots of decks may be weaving in Billowing Fan. Maybe even some of those ones that can't really afford to weave 4 Crushing Hammers in, they can just play like 1 or 2 Billowing Fan and say that that's going to be enough disruption for them to prevent people from attacking. So yeah, a ton of good precedent here. We've seen Giratina work in Fire decks before. There's a ton of crushing in the game right now. There's a lot of reasons for us to like Billowing Fan.
Definitely. Next up, we have Camping Gear. Camping Gear reads, if you play this card, your turn ends, search your deck for a card and put it into your hand and then shuffle your deck. So essentially, you're getting 1 free card at the end of your turn, but you have to end your turn. And there's we already have a lot of, quite nice end of turn effects. Gourmandize is popular in some archetypes, but obviously Intrepid Sword on Zacian V is another one. And in the metal archetypes, also getting that upside of attaching any metal you find there to the Zacian to start attacking as well. So we've seen that a lot of these end of turn effects can be very powerful, but the difference is drawing cards typically in the early turns can be a little bit better than tutoring 1 card, especially as drawing cards can lead into getting some more Pokemon out, some more energy out, whereas I feel like this card you're typically just going to be grabbing maybe a supporter just to guarantee you have the correct supporter for next turn, something like that. And those kind of situations, things like Poke Gear seem like they're going to be a much better option for you, because you're going to have a lot more flexibility and not have to end your turn. There's a little bit of risk versus reward, but I feel like we have cards like Jirachi, Pokegear, all of these kind of things that can search out specific items, specific cards we want. We even get the Manaphy and Celebi from Shining Fates to be able to search out Pokemon and Energy mid-turn as well. So it feels like we have a variety of different sort of effects right now that let you just get a card you want, and using an item to end your turn and just get one card, especially in the Marnie heavy meta that we're in right now, feels like it's a very, very weak option. It feels similar to some of the sort of like the Rotom items that we've seen. Obviously, Rotom Bike has never really seen any play. We do get this new Rotom Choice in Shining Fates, which improves the Rotom items a little bit, but I think everyone's looking more towards Rotom Phone than anything. And when paired with Oranguru, that's almost a camping gear anyway in some situations, if not just finding you a supporter to carry on digging to try and find the one card you want from camping gear anyway. So yeah, overall pretty underwhelming. It's interesting to see some of these really powerful mechanics coming back with kind of a stipulation. This one I think is a little bit too weak in terms of actually being able to ever see play, though, because ending your turn, especially in meta where Marnie at any point in the game is like basically never surprising, it's just a little bit too weak.
Next up, we have the return of Energy Recycler into the format. It allows you to shuffle 5 basic energy cards from your discard pile into your deck. This is going to be really nice for some expensive attack cost Pokemon that you're trying to flood into play with some of these Rain Dance style effects. We actually get a second Rain Dancer from Battle Styles, a Chirim, that allows you to attach as many grass energy from your hand to your non-rulebox Pokemon. So Frostmoth and Cherim decks could really enjoy this. I know Rillaboom, as of late, has played like double Ornery Rod, and it's definitely going to like having Energy Recycler as an option, so you can spam that Voltage Beat, even if things are, discarding from themselves with some of their attacks, like Rillaboom VMAX, or just getting knocked out with things like Tapu Bulu if it's Cherim, or if it's a one prize thing for sort of Frostmoth. So yeah, a really welcome include to these decks. The only thing is that these are on the rogue tier of things right now. So that's going to be reflected in the rating of this card. I think it's a good include for both these decks. Doesn't change the power level of them too much, but it's a nice card that they can use. Now, at the same time, Frostmoth does already have Nessa that's sort of competing with this for immediate access to those energy cards. So this recycler may end up only being like a one-of, but still a nice include for the amount of Rain Dance that we have in the format.
Next up, we have another reprint, a much more welcome reprint, I think, in general. We have Escape Rope. Each player switches their active Pokemon with one of their bench Pokemon. Your opponent switches first. So this is essentially sort of a switch on both sides, which in a format where we have so many sort of you can't attack next turn style effects, things like Zacian and Reshizard, both very, very popular attackers right now, kind of locking themselves out of attacking next turn. This is a massive include because already these decks are running a high count of switch and maybe even 1 or 2 bird keepers. Well, now you have the flexibility of having more items rather than bird keepers when you'd maybe want to be using a welder or a research or something like that, a Marnie. But also you have that little extra upside of if your opponent only has 1 bench Pokemon, it also works as kind of a gusting effect, which is fantastic in the early turns. Maybe if you're going second and your opponent hasn't had a particularly strong setup, there can be some very nice situations there. But also in the late game when you're sort of down to 1 or 2 prizes and your opponent's put up a VMAX and just said, I'm going to make you take these last prizes through a VMAX rather than something weak on the bench. Escape Rope also acts as like a pseudo gust in that situation. So yeah, it's essentially a Theon and a Switch combined, which is pretty nice. This card has basically always been very, very popular ever since it's been in format. It's always seen massive success. It's seen huge success in terms of things like Jirachi and Snorlax styles effects as well, where you want these in the active, but eventually you're going to want to start attacking with the things you've been able to power up on the bench whilst you're, setting up. So obviously it helps move these Pokemon. Obviously Snorlax has a massive retreat and Jirachi puts itself to sleep. So typically these two can be a little bit more difficult to switch. We've seen lots of scoop up nets, lots of switches. And again, like I say, some bird keepers in lists anyway, but this is obviously item based, which is nice. So that's pretty good. There's also very niche combinations with things like Spikemuth and Spiritomb, letting you rack up the damage counters and perform big Anguish Cry plays sort of out of nowhere, especially as this doesn't count as your retreat for turn. So a couple of Switch and a couple of Escape Rope paired with like a Cape of Toughness, and a Spiritomb can actually be hitting a huge amount of damage in one turn, kind of out of nowhere, which is pretty impressive. Similarly, Orbeetle likes to move between 2 or 3 different Orbeetles per turn just to get 3 Eerie Beams off and then hit with a G-Max Wave, trying to get maximum value. And this is a great include for that kind of deck. The deck's already running 4 Switch and 4 Bird Keeper, and I don't see that really changing. but also having the addition of a couple of escape rope, especially when you're already peppering the bench with the Eerie Beam ability, weakening stuff, being able to then G-Max Wave into them. I can see this being a very, very welcome addition in that deck as well. So there's lots of great uses for this item, and I think it's going to be very, very popular as it ever has been. There'll be attackers basically throughout the season, throughout Escape Rope's tenure, that will want to see this. Sometimes in addition to Switch, sometimes like seeing this preferably over Switch. So yeah, there's loads of different sort of situations, and the fact that you have the upside of potentially gusting up something your opponent doesn't want to have in the active that they're trying to set up maybe for later on in the game is just going to be upside. So yeah, a fantastic trainer that's basically always been popular ever since it's been printed, and a really welcome addition, especially with so many Reshizards and Zacians, as well as obviously Urshifu has the Gale Thrust attack that lets you do more damage if it's switching from the bench this turn as well. So all of these different effects kind of all are pretty happy to see an Escape Rope back in the format. Yeah, I think it's going to be quite a popular include in a lot of decks, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm really happy to see this, just because it's not, stamp to 2, do you have boss? Now you actually have a chance to have extra plays, even if you're using like researchers or Marnies or anything like that. You have stuff to dig towards. And I think it's actually going to have the biggest impact for ADP, because so many people complain that they can't hit 310 damage on turn 2 after they've GX attacked. Now you have an easy rope around, and they never really put 2 tag teams into play. So it's going to be much easier for them to rope take, at least 1 or 2 prizes on something, and then not insta lose the game because they didn't deal with ADP on their GX attack turn. So I think it's really good against ADP. Obviously, ADP can use it themselves as well. So I don't think ADP is necessarily like going anywhere, but I think this is a really nice include specifically for that. We've seen Fiona be used mostly in the fire decks so far, and I think Rope can sort of take over that mantle so that you can push the ADP out the way and then start taking aggressive prizes with like Flare Strike, Double Blaze, and even with Center Scorch and that sort of thing. So I think it will give many decks higher percentage points. Like we've seen Mad Party play double Great Catcher just to try and like be proactive on ADP, or just push it to the back so you can hit Dedenne for a knockout because you've only got to that level of damage output. And Rope can be a really similar thing. So I'm really happy to see how that shakes things up. Next up, we have another very, very good card returning to our format. It's going to be Level Ball. I think a lot of people just love having this in the game. It's such a well-designed card for a specific niche set of cards, which don't always see enough love in the game. It allows you to search your deck for a Pokemon with 90 hit points or less, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. For the most part, we're looking for evolving basics or some little helpful abilities here and there. And also, it does fill the niche of getting a couple of stage 1 cards. Some of the most notable ones for me is going to be Whimsicott as an attacking threat. Psychic typing is going to be very relevant going into Battle Styles meta because there are 2 Urshifu VMAXs coming out in the set. And of course, people may be using Mewtwo's to deal with Urshifus, so there will also be an increased amount of Mewtwo that you can be hitting with Whimsy, which is very cool. I also think, obviously, Mad Party is going to really enjoy this. It gets them every target apart from Galarian Mr. Rhyme, so that's going to be awesome for you. Gets you early Sinistes, Poltergeists, and Bunnelbys, and obviously Dedenne just for fodder, which is great. And I think also really, really notably is Cinccino. Cinccino is an incredible draw engine, oftentimes seen in Control, and Control has still been doing well. In fact, in the Players' Cup 3, the highest ranking EU player was playing a Control deck and using Cinccino and Munchlax, which Level Ball can completely search out. So you can get, 2 to 3 Cinccino on the board much more quickly and efficiently without having to use comms and that sort of thing. So that is very good for Control, for one thing, but also just any deck may consider having 4 Mincino, 4 Cinccino, and 4 Level Ball, and that becomes your sort of stamp proofing / draw cards package. I feel like we've seen things like Sylvali GX in Center Scorch recently, and I think Cinccino could be becoming a package within these sorts of decks, like I said, for stamp proofing or just giving you extra cards throughout the game. So I'm really excited to see that. I think Cinccino is a crazy busted ability, and Level Ball is a huge enabler for that. So that's why we're giving it the 5-star treatment. We know it's going into Mad Party for sure, which is around, like tier 2 right now. Whimsicott is probably an improving archetype. And then there's the whole Cinccino thing that really pushes it over the top. So really happy to see this return.
Definitely. And you can see just from the array of the cards that Joe didn't even talk about that this is just going to fit into so many different archetypes. You've got it being more search for decks like Frostmoth, Salazzle, getting early game Spiritombs and Drillers out as well. It's just so good for single prize archetypes in general, as well as just the Cincino lines that we can then end up putting in stuff like Center Scorch and stuff. Having just more support for single prize archetypes, I think, is definitely a step in the right direction. Also, we may not necessarily feel the maximum impact of this until sort of rotation when cards like ADP leave, but I think this is already a huge step in the right direction for getting some more of these single prize archetypes back on the map and really competing with some of the top decks right now. Next up, we have Vitality Jar. This is a single strike card, the first one I believe that we've spoken about. This lets you to choose 2 single strike energy cards from your discard pile and shuffle them into your deck. Right now, we only have 1 single strike energy card, and that is single strike energy, which is basically a strong energy for fighting, and that also provides fighting in dark for single prize Pokemon alone. That already that sounds incredible, right? It's strong energy, which is one of the best energies that's ever been printed. It's special energies that's ever been printed. But as you'll learn when when we talk about Houndoom, Urshifu, and Primeape, these cards already do a huge amount of damage and have a lot of synergy. Houndoom searches out these energy and attaches them, so shuffling them into the deck isn't even a downside. It's not like you even want them in your hand. You actually pretty much always want single strike energies in your deck, apart from like 1 maybe on turn 1. The rest of the time, you're pretty happy that they're in the deck. So this is just fantastic. Houndoom is basically the lifeblood, or is going to be the lifeblood of a lot of these single strike decks, because and the energy acceleration he provides is absolutely bonkers. It's a shame we can only play 4 of the single strike energy, but that's kind of mitigated by this Vitality Jar. So yeah, this is obviously just a very, very strong card, and again will kind of be the backbone of basically every single strike sort of deck package that we end up using. We've only given it the 4 rather than the 5 because in our testing, and again you'll see this a little bit more when we talk about some of the single strike attackers, we found single strike Urshifu to be a little bit underwhelming in terms of reaching that 5-star mark. And similarly, Primeape, whilst really exciting and a lot of fun, I think right now doesn't quite have the chops to keep up with some of these other archetypes. It's still 2 stage 1s that are both pretty integral, because you need kind of Houndooms to be setting up your Primeapes because you need 2 energy, and you then need to be damaging your bench for Primeape's Frenzy Bomb to actually be doing a significant amount of damage. So that archetype is a little bit on the weaker side. It's probably going to settle itself in one of the rogue tiers. So that's kind of, as a package, brought all of these single strike cards down to around a 4-star, whereas you'll see a lot of the rapid strike cards are closer to a 5-star. But in general, like, this is just a great backbone to have for basically, we know we're getting single strike support for the next 2 or 3 sets. So this is just a great backbone to have to be able to build upon. Having universal energy acceleration for single strike Pokemon, along with a fantastic energy card and a trainer right here that just backs it all up, bodes really well for the future of these archetypes. It's just, unfortunately, they don't quite cut the mustard yet, I don't think, in terms of being everything we want. But that being said, single strike actually is still a very, very strong deck. It's just a little bit inconsistent at times, which is why we've dropped it to the 4-star.
Yeah, I mean, not everything can be the meta breaker, right? So 4-star is still us respecting single strike to be like around tier 2 probably, and unfortunately when there's these cards that synergize well together, it means they sort of live together and die together. They're all going to have that similar rating. Like we said with the rapid strike fan, the single strikers, they don't have the same search ability they have with Octillery, but their upside is that there's a stadium that we'll see later, which means even if you don't want to play this card at the right time, you can still discard it at times and draw 2 cards off of it. So that's another good thing for this card, seeing as though it's very situational. You want to see this in the mid to late game, then it becomes an all-star, and it's the way that you close games. But even if you draw it early, as long as you find your stadium as well, they can at least be a draw 2. So that's another upside for a card like this, which you want to draw at specific moments of the game. Now it becomes, accessible throughout more periods of the game, which is also really cool. We move on to EXP Share, another returning card into our format. I'm a sucker for EXP Share, guys, so the rating is 3 stars because I'll, at the very least, be playing this in a ton of decks because I really do feel this effect is quite good. We've seen how awkward and annoying Crushing Hammer has been. So having some energy retention in the game, I feel, is going to be a really good step in the right direction. Now, we have a lot of 2 and 3 prize Pokemon, so sometimes EXP Share is going to only work once, but sometimes that one activation is going to be enough to keep a chain of attackers going. Think about your VMAX decks that only attach 1 per turn, Eternatus and Dragapult. These historically have really been hurt by Crushing Hammers. Even if, it's a hammer onto the active, then you take a hit, then you're having to commit an extra energy attachment to that active and attack once more before it gets knocked out. If you establish an EXP Share on a bench Eterna or a bench Dragapult, now it means that as that other one gets knocked out in the active, you can then continue that chain the following turn. So I think for these 1 energy attachment decks, EXP Share could be a real lifeline. It's going to be always an interaction between EXP Share and the likes of Tool Scrapper and Dangerous Drill, which you do have to kind of keep in mind. Your opponent can have a soft check to this card, so I don't really feel like EXP Share will become like a 4 of in a ton of decks, but I do think it could be a good step in the right direction. We do have an Axew in the format, which can't be targeted by your opponent's supporters or item cards, I think it is. So they basically, it's like a Regirock. They can't gust this up and they can't get rid of the tool on Axew, so it could be a way for you to just store up energies onto him with the XP Share. That could be for some energy flooding decks, like Bolton V, for example, or you could use it with Nanu and turn into some cool dark type attackers as well. So that's some stuff to bear in mind. And at the same time, Zacian is a very good card. It's recently just got a rusted sword. So you could be playing a lone Zacian attacking deck that also includes 1 or 2 EXP Share, so that you have Brave Blades that can be doing 260 in certain situations, but then also backup Brave Blades to maybe finish things off in other situations. So I have seen, turbo patches make their way into Turbozation, and I think EXP Share could be an alternate option. So right now it feels like speculative in a handful of archetypes, but in enough archetypes for me to really respect it at that 3-star.
Definitely. And I think the whole way through this meta, we've felt kind of because of the hammers thing, but there's been so many people that have really felt like it's the meta is over so quickly, and if you miss an attachment, it's just over, which just makes EXP Share even better because it makes like your 1 attachment potentially 2 attachments. And in a format where it's so important to get 1 attachment, being able to just lock in a 2nd attachment and kind of forget about it, especially given that Tool Scrapper and Dangerous Drill aren't really that popular right now. This is, like you say, just going to ebb and flow with how popular that kind of cards like that are. But in the situations where Scrapper and Drill are on the low, I feel like EXP Share is going to make attackers so much more consistent and make decks so much more consistent at just churning out hit after hit after hit and just being able to perform some of these strong attacks like Max Phantom and Dread End. Next up, we have Raging Scroll, another single strike item. This is a tool that you can only attach to, or you can attach to anything, but only single strike Pokemon can use the attack on it. The attack is Fury for 1 fighting energy or 1 single strike energy, remember, so you don't even have to really be running fighting energy alone because you're going to be running single strike energy. And this does 10 damage plus 10 more for each counter on this Pokemon. So it's basically an outrage style effect for 1 energy, which is fantastic when when you look at the amount of HP single strike Urshifu has. There's not going to be much that's one-shotting Urshifu. 330 HP is monstrous, and given that you can even check its weakness by playing a Jirachi GX, there actually really isn't that many Pokemon that can even get close to one-shotting this right now. There's things like Blown maybe, but in general, that's a massive amount of HP to deal with, meaning that kind of synergistically, once you've used your G-Max 1 blow, which does 270, and you discard all energy attached to Urshifu, typically you're going to be kind of left stranded in the active, probably not really going to be able to do much next turn. Well, if your opponent hits into you, you can just attach a Raging Scroll, attach an energy, and all of a sudden you've got another threat out of nowhere that they basically can't ignore because, this is going to be doing probably upwards of 200 damage potentially every turn for 1 energy whilst you're powering up a second Urshifu on the bench. So this synergizes really, really well with that GX attack. Outrage style effects have always been very popular, but this one being for 1 energy, which can go on a Pokemon with massive HP that already has damage buffs, and also it gets damage buffs by Houndoom attaching energy, because for every energy you attach with Houndoom, you have to put 2 counters on the Pokemon that you attach to. It all synergizes really, really well, and all of a sudden you've got Raging Scroll, which we've seen Raging Scroll do upwards of 300 damage in our test games, and it's not actually that surprising when it does. It's very quick how strong this just one energy attack is. So there aren't really any uses for it other than single strike. And again, these cards, whilst some of the niche cards or some of the more broad cards like Vitality Jar and Houndoom will maybe see a little bit more experimentation, unfortunately, single strike really will just live and die with Urshifu VMAX. But it's so powerful in that archetype that it basically is like a secondary attacker alone in the archetype, which is just fantastic. So yeah, very, very strong card. And even if the archetype isn't great, this is, again, just a pivotal piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it feels like this is an actual driving factor in the deck's win condition, because getting rid of 4 energy means that, you have to have 3 Houndoom in play to reload, but now you have the scroll, which is just vital for you. Even if you're getting prodded by things, your opponent's trying to play around the Raging Scroll. Because you're a fighting type, you can Raging Scroll plus Gust, Dedenes, and Crobats, and that's going to be fantastic for you as well. So a big part player in that deck, and one of the reasons why I think it will still remain, at least a tier 2 threat. So yeah, very, very good tool. Next up, we have Tool Jammer. It's a tool that says, as long as the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active position, Pokemon tools attached to your opponent's active have no effect. So that scroll we just talked about and a handful of other important tools in the format being disabled is pretty decent. Now, the awkward thing about Tool Jammer is you need to be playing a deck that doesn't already want to have other tools. So anything that's currently playing Big Charm, Air Balloon, Goggles, Vitband, Rusted Sword, any of those things, you can't really play your Tool Jammer unless you think that's a stronger tool than the ones you're already playing. But that is jamming a good pool of cards right now. I think these tools are seeing a lot of play in the format, and this could be an in for you for certain decks. The only real worry is that there's so few archetypes that don't need tools right now. There aren't that many homes. And at the same time, Tool Scrapper is already in the format. The upside of the Tool Jammer is you can attach it to an attacker, and it can stay in play for like multiple turns. Whereas Scrapper, could get Dedenade or researched away before you can get any value out of it. So there are upsides here, but the downside is that it's only decks that don't need tools already. We have seen some precedent for this, and like Dangerous Drill is played in Eternatus. Eternatus would be one of the things I'd think would want a Tool Jammer, but the Drill is just more versatile because it can also hit energies at the same time. So at the moment, it's like a decent enough card, but there aren't enough VMAXs that don't play tools right now that can afford to put the Jammer in. That's the key problem for the card right now.
Next up, we have Whirlpool Scroll, basically identical to the Rapid Strike Raging Scroll, but this is the Single Strike Raging Scroll, I should say. This is the Rapid Strike version. Interestingly, the Single Strike attacks for 1 energy, whereas this one is 3 energy, which is kind of the opposite of what you'll see for some of these effects in some of these Pokemon. Whirlpool Scroll does for a fighting and 2 colorless, 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. So it's basically a 30 spread for 3 energy. That's not terrible. We've seen decks that do 30 spreads in the past see success. But unfortunately, because this is 3 energy, this is actually still 2 attachments. The single strike decks have the Houndoom, but obviously we've mentioned that the Rapid Strike decks have Octillery, which means they have more tutoring, but they don't have energy acceleration. So this actually is basically always going to be 2 attachments. And for 2 attachments, this effect actually isn't that strong. There's obvious synergy with Gmax Rapid Flow on the Rapid Strike Urshifu, which does 2 120 snipes. There's, like I say, obvious synergy there. But basically the things you're going to want to be sniping are going to be Dedenes and Crobats, that kind of thing. Gale Thrust into Gmax Rapid Flow does a nice 270, which knocks out almost all of the prizes in the tag teams in the format right now. So and the extra 30 from Vortex doesn't really push you into 2-shotting the VMAX range. So it's kind of in this awkward spot where it doesn't really do anything particular except to a couple of targets, i.e. things like Dedenne and Crobat. But we have things like Telescopic Sight, which actually just often end up trading better into those cards. With a Telescopic Sight, you end up doing 150 with 2 snipes, which is obviously just a Zigzagoon ping away from one-shotting a Dedenne. And even though that's more cards and that's more steps, I think that's going to be far more achievable than being able to have time to Vortex and then Gmax rapid flow, especially in a hammer-based meta. That combo is less cards, but I think is actually more complex than just popping a Telescopic Sight and playing a Zigzagoon down, because a lot of these cards are insta-play, whereas you need to have the scroll and you need to keep the energy, and then you need to hope that you keep the energy to be able to rapid flow the turn after, stuff like that. Obviously, the scroll is searchable, is tutorable with the Octillery's Rapid Strike search, but I think in general, if you're looking to do a little bit of an extra damage buff, Telescopic Sight plus Zigzagoon will probably get you over the line, because in almost all scenarios, you're going to be looking at Dedenes and Crobats to be finishing off with Gmax Rapid Flow, and in most scenarios, they're going to get you over the line. It's an interesting card, and I think there will be niche uses for it, and I could see this in certain metas being quite important, but I think whilst we're still in a hammer meta, there's not going to be much use, because it feels like the targets are basically the same targets that you're going to want to be gunning down with Zigzagoon and Telescopic Sight anyway. So yeah, and even those cards we haven't been particularly sold on yet. Zigzagoon is pretty much staple in a lot of our Urshifu lists now, but Telescopic Sight, even that still feels like it's quite niche, because you're so honestly. Rapid Strike Urshifu is so efficient in its attacks. You probably don't need to be doing the double snipe on the bench to try and win the game. You've probably already been able to get yourself into a position where you can potentially just take 5 prizes already. So even though the Whirlpool Scroll is a bit more damage and a bit more sort of bang for your buck and what you're getting for your payoff, the more flexible Telescopic Sight hasn't quite made it into some of our lists, and I think it is less versatile than that.
Yeah, I just think you'd rather be using Urshifu's actual attacks than this for the most part, and that's why we're rating it 1. On to the supporters then. We have a single strike supporter in Bruno. It forces you to shuffle your hand into your deck, then draw 4. If any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn, you draw 7 cards instead. So it's almost Cynthia's Feelings from back in Legends Awakened. It draws you 1 less card than that, but a Shuffle 7 is pretty welcomed in the format right now. A very, very strong card effect, and it is another one of these cards that improves as something's been KO'd. So we have sort of this precedent with Rosa right now. The main downside of Rosa is that she's like literally unusable if you haven't suffered a knockout. So Bruno at least can be that sort of panic button option that can shuffle draw 4. And let's not forget that he has that lovely tag in his top right corner, which means if you're playing Tower of Darkness, you can be just foddering him to draw 2 cards if it's not the right moment to use him. So I think that's the real perk of Bruno. I think his main home will be this sort of Primate Poundoom style deck where you probably will be playing those Tower of Darkness for extra consistency, because in that deck you'll have like 20 outs to use the Tower of Darkness to draw if you're playing a handful of Bruno. But even if you don't have that tag, I think, if you're a stage 1 attacking deck, it's probably better than Rosa. Rosa's normally trying to fish out rare candy pieces to get those stage 2s online, whereas Bruno just shuffling in and getting 7 is a pretty big deal, and gives you good access to a ton of things in addition to just like researches. I think one thing that stage 1 decks and other 1 prize decks hate using is Mani, because you put yourself just to 5 cards, and that's a really sort of panic situation in a lot of decks. You just don't have enough draw when you're looking for your next stage 1, your next attachment, your next basic, all in the same hand. 5 cards just isn't enough value for you. So I think Bruno is a welcome addition to some of these 1 prize decks. It may even force a small single strike package into these decks where you play like 4 Tower of Darkness, 4 Bruno, and then they become additional draw outs for you. It's like having a Cincino on the board, just having a Tower of Darkness in play. So having those excess stadiums that you can bin off and the Bruno that you can bin off could be value throughout the entire game as well. So just something to think about there.
Next up, we have Cheryl. Cheryl is very similar to Pokemon Nurse from Expedition. Heal damage from your evolution Pokemon, then discard all energy attached to your Pokemon you healed in this way. Now, obviously, it's not just VMAXs that are evolutions, but realistically, the damage cap is so high right now. A lot of the 1 prize evolution Pokemon aren't going to be living a hit, so really this can basically say heal all damage from your VMAXs. And honestly, that's a very, very strong effect. We've said how tanky 330, 340 HP is. And honestly, when you have to deal with that once, it's annoying. When you have to deal with that twice because you have to get through two, it's even more annoying. When you have to deal with that three, maybe four times because you've been able to Cheryl one or two targets, that's really going to put a strain on your opponent's resources. Especially when we have Weavile GX and a new Bronzong that we'll talk about in the One Prizes video with a similar ability to Weavile Shadow Connection, which lets you move your metal energy around. Basically, you can move all the energy off, do all your healing, put all the energy back on, and basically act as if you were never attacked in the first place. Obviously, this isn't a research, this isn't a boss, this is a very passive supporter on your opponent's side because you're just healing the damage off. And in some instances, you kind of are going to want to be bossing to win the game rather than not lose the game. But in certain archetypes, things like Snorlax, where you're just a huge chunk of HP. Also, there's a new Corviknight VMAX with just a massive amount of HP, and when paired with things like Goggles and Luca Metal, becomes really tanky. In those type of archetypes, your basically your win con is to not lose rather than to win, because eventually you'll just do enough hits to take 6 prizes. You're not trying to race anyone down or anything like that. And in those kind of situations, Cheryl is going to be really, really exciting to see because it's just going to make your opponent's game plan so much harder, whereas you're just churning out damage turn after turn after turn, and eventually you're going to be able to take 6 prizes because they've just hit basically a brick wall. Also, in terms of it also really is nice for archetypes that only really require one attachment. And Rapid Strike Urshifu, after discarding all of the energy on it, if it can survive a hit, it's just one attachment away from being able to do Gale Thrust for 150 again, and 1 for 150 is obviously absolutely bonkers. Also, dealing double damage to things like Crobat and Dedenne for being able to take surprises is great. But if you're able to, use your Gmax Rapid Flow, again, another really, really efficient attack, take a load of damage, you can then Cheryl, find a switching out, and you're back into doing 150 and threatening another Gmax Rapid Flow the next turn, basically wiping off your opponent's last turn as well. So huge tempo swing in the attack, and then another huge tempo swing in terms of putting your opponent back a step because they've basically done nothing for 2 turns. I think Cheryl has a lot of different archetypes that she could see play in. It's never going to be, or I'm not going to say it's never going to be a 4 of, because things like tanky decks and wall decks will probably want this as a 4 of if they're not playing any energy. But I think in attacking archetypes, it's probably only ever going to be like a 2 of. But the turns you hit Cheryl, you're going to take such a tempo swing that it basically will be like bossing for game or Marnieing or stamping or something like that. Just one of these huge tempo swing type turns, but instead you're healing rather than dealing with a threat, which sometimes is basically all you need to do.
Yeah, it feels like if you build around Cheryl, it's going to be +1 turn, and that's really, really insane when you have 5-turn games. So yeah, when you hit the Cheryl and build around her, she's going to feel really bad for some people. And like you said, there's transfer style abilities and there's one attachment things. I've only got the Snorlax in here because he's triple acceleratable, so you could 3 CE, he'll have no energies, you can Cheryl, that sort of thing. Obviously, he's weak to fighting, so there may be better targets out there, but just wanted to demonstrate that you can have any one attachment dudes out there, could really take advantage. Next up, we have Korrina's Motivation. We're actually rating this card quite significantly higher than the majority of the community by the looks of things. It's a simple effect and one that hasn't seen play in previous formats because it's a spiritual reprint of Bianca. It just says draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. But there's one important thing here, and that's the tag. It's a Rapid Strike supporter, and we believe that there are a ton of different ways that you can play Rapid Strike Urshifu, and we believe many of them will be successful, and it's going to be a meta-defining card, realistically, in how strong its attacks are. And we believe there'll be at least like 1 or 2 builds of Rapid Strike, which will be playing a 1/1 or 2/2 line of Octillery, and then this becomes just a phenomenal stamp-proofing card, where there are so many situations, thanks to the type coverage of Urshifu, that you just need to either boss or great catch of a game. Your opponent's going to stamp you down low, and you just don't have the boss currently in hand. Well, you can Rapid Strike search for Korrina, and then that gets you back up to 6 cards, which can help you find great catchers, or, like quick balls for Crobats and Dedennes, and keep going to eventually hit that great catcher. So, yeah, I feel it's going to be a phenomenal stamp proofing card for you. And just in panic situations where you only have ball search but no supporter, you can use this artillery, get it into play and instantly find Korrina, even if it's just getting you like 4 cards or something like that. That's going to keep you ticking over nicely. So we found the need for it for certain right now. Stamp has been extremely dominant in the game. Center Scorch plays it, Mewtwo variants, Pikarom, of course, one of the key decks in the format that tries to stamp paralyze. If you can artillery for Korrina just gets you your switch out. Those are going to be huge turns. So I believe Korrina is probably going to make it as a 1/2 count in any artillery based build of Urshi, which I'm fully on board with, and I think will certainly be towards that top tier of play right now.
Definitely. There's been countless games in our testing where the Urshifu player has been streaks ahead and then they've just lost to a stamp, where they've even had like 1 or 2 turns to be able to win the game. It's just that the stamp is so crippling because they're already down to 1 prize, because that's how quickly Urshifu can take 5 prizes, where a Korrina would just give you kind of the push, even if it's not to win the game that turn, to force another stamp out of the opponent. And that in itself can be really strong. It's like the perfect blend. Like you say, Bianca's never been overwhelming. It saw a little bit of niche play here and there when it was out, but it's never been overwhelming, of course. But because of the perfect storm of Stamp being in format, as well as Dedenne and Crobat and Great Catcher, it makes Korrina so much better than Bianca, because it's a better card for stamp proofing, but also drawing 6 isn't just drawing 6 anymore. It's drawing 6 and maybe drawing another 6, and then maybe drawing another 2 or 3, and then gusting. So it's kind of just this loop of all of a sudden drawing 6, where it was just draw up to 6, really wasn't that impressive. But now drawing 6 can just get you into such a chain of winning the game. It's going to be really impressive. And I think it's very easy to look over this card, compare it to Bianca. I did initially. I looked at the card and was like, this is just Bianca. I don't see where this is going. And then after a couple of games with Octillery on board and just being not able to do anything, Korrina started going in the decks and you immediately see her power. So yeah, very strong card. Next up, we have Rapid Strike Stance Mustard. We have 2 different mustards. So this one will be going over... They both have minor differences. I'll talk a little bit more about the engine with this one, and then Joe will talk about some of the sort of applications for the other one. But in general, Mustard is a spiritual successor to Archie and Maxi back from Primal Clash, 2 very fan favorite cards. So it's really cool to see these effects back. Unfortunately, they're not quite as powerful as Maxi and Archie have been. They've both been meta-defining cards, and I don't think Mustard will be. Because we have things like Dedenne and Crobat in format already, where you can just do so much with your turn. This is a really powerful effect back in the day, because we didn't have sort of as strong effects as Dedenne and Crobat, but now we have such access. They're not quite as strong, but even so, there's slight differences. Both of these have to be the only card in hand. Rapid Strike lets you search your discard pile for a Rapid Strike Pokemon and put it onto the bench, and Single Strike searches the deck. So you have to build your deck a little bit differently around both of these cards. You then get to draw 5 cards, so you're not completely left stranded, which is pretty good. Obviously, that means you can search out for Pokemon that you would normally have to evolve, but you don't have to evolve, which is great. So you can get these VMAX Urshifus out without having to go through the awkwardness of finding an evolution, finding the basic, waiting a turn, and then evolving the regular V into the VMAX. But you can also get some stage 1s and stage 2s, which is pretty cool. And I think these are both definitely cards to keep an eye on. The engine we have right now is kind of, I think, what's letting down some of these cards. We have Radar for hand thinning, as well as Dedenne to be able to dig to try and reach a new hand to try and build your combo from that. We also have a really nice package in Rotom Phone plus Guru. I mentioned Rotom Phone earlier on, alongside Guru, and that is a pretty impressive sort of tutor a card into your hand, which can find you the puzzle piece you need to discard your hand down to be able to use one of these mustard cards, as well as obviously having Jirachi to similarly find pieces. Unfortunately, neither of these cards are in a format with computer search, execute, or particularly any great targets. Things like the Urshifus are actually some of the better targets. There's no real consistency targets, which I think is one of the biggest reasons why things like Maxi were so strong. Maxi could search out Gallade, which basically smoothed out your top decks for the rest of the game. So you played this really sort of scuffed draw engine to get the Gallade out, but then the Gallade was kind of making up for that for the rest of the game, as well as being a threat. Whereas at the moment, we're just getting an attacker out, which means we're not really developing the board too much because we're going to be throwing the attacker in the active and eventually we're going to be losing it. We're not getting a nice bench sitter to draw cards to tutor the top deck, stuff like that. So it's very easy to compare these two to two of the most powerful supporters we've ever had and expect them to be good. But I think a combination of the targets not being as good as Maxi and Archie, as well as the engines to try and build these off, a lack of execute and a lack of comp search and battle compressor is basically backbreaking for these archetypes or these style of decks, unfortunately. So they're very niche and they will be great for highlight moments, but I think unfortunately both of the mustard cards, I should say, aren't quite going to fit the bill, which is pretty upsetting to say because I think they're very exciting effects. But yeah, they do have some niche uses and they do have some pretty cool targets you can pick out. And ones that you should keep an eye out for the next couple of sets. We know we're getting more Rapid Strike and Single Strike support, so these are ones that you should just keep in the back of your mind because if we ever get a pseudo compressor reprint, we're getting a pseudo VS Seeker reprint for Single Strike, so that already kind of buffs up the Single Strike mustard a little bit. So yeah, we may get to a point where these will be proper engines, but right now they're just a little bit lackluster.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem as we go on to the next one is, I mean, this is basically the same effect, right? But the supporter rule change has basically killed these cards because if your opponent just chooses to go second, then your whole build around has been essentially pointless. Like at that stage, you're only helping cheat VMAXs into play that could have been into play anyway just by manually evolving them because they're essentially stage ones. This mustard, the single strike one, we think is even worse than the rapid just because the targets just aren't there for you. If you're completely warping your deck to build around this sort of engine, you want to have instant payoff. The payoff of the rapid strike is that you can hit a turn 150 damage. But that could also be done just by playing a welder-based build. You could use 100 Furious Blows on the regular V from Rapid Strike Urshifu, or you could use 130 damage on Empoleon with a Rapid Strike attachment plus a welder. So if you want to have tempo damage, I think the welder-based route is going to be more reliable. For the single strike builds, there's no early game attacks you can use with Urshifu VMAX, so really you'd just be looking towards something like Ember or Houndoom, Ember helping you buff your damage even more, Houndoom being an extra accelerator into play. So I think if Single Strike Mustard is ever going to see play, it's going to be like a 1/2 of in the deck, and you don't really warp your deck too much around it. You just try and have those random games where it can be that third Houndoom for you or something like that, because that's the board state you want to be as the Single Strike deck. You want to have 3 in play so you can chain Gmax one blow like twice in a game, essentially, is the dream board state. And he could help you high roll into that. But I think you never are going to be able to warp your deck list in that way to make him work consistently. So both of these are really hurt compared to their predecessors just by the supporter rule change. And currently the limited targets available just firstly don't synergize well with Single Strike, and secondly can be done in less invasive ways in the Rapid Strike case. So those are the reasons why we think they're not going to do too well. Next up we have... Oh, sorry, Jack.
Next up we have Phoebe. Phoebe is one of these kind of supporters that has very niche use, but you can never really forget about because it's kind of like it's nowhere near as strong as something like a Hex Maniac, but it kind of has that Hex Maniac feel where you're having a you're not drawing a card, you're not bossing again, nothing like that, but you're actually doing something to maybe alter the game state a little bit. Phoebe lets you ignore all effects on your opponent's active Pokemon with your VMAX's attacks. Typically, those kind of wall-breaking effects can be quite good. One of the biggest issues at the moment with that is the fact that our supporter pool is so strong that you don't really want to be paying a supporter card just to get a one-turn wall break, because decks like Decidueye Obstagoon often have more than one wall. Their whole deck is built around walls, and you're going to need a more than one wall break to get through them. So typically that's not great. Similarly with Zamazenta, you're going to need to one-shot the Zamazenta and hope they don't have another Zamazenta, because otherwise you're going to have to be spending an Eldegoss maybe to play the Phoebe if you even have that access to that anymore. So it's not great. Obviously, wall breaking is a very, very desirable thing to have. We see that the single strike Urshifu has a wall breaking effect, as well as Reshizard, obviously being used in the past basically as a wall breaker. So obviously, like I say, a very desirable effect to have. But when you have to pay a whole supporter card for it, it becomes a lot more niche. And even though some of these archetypes can be really annoying, things like Decigoons, as well as Zamazenta, just being frustrating for VMAX decks in general, I feel like typically you're probably going to see more success playing an actual card that can be reused. That's like a good attacker, because the one downside of these a lot of these Pokemon as attackers is they have relatively sort of lackluster attacks. It's like 130s, 140s, 90s in Decidueye's case, and sometimes you can sort of outlive that kind of um, damage for 2 or 3 turns, maybe putting you in a position where you can deal with 1 or 2 walls. So playing an attacker, I think, typically is going to be better than just playing a single supporter card um, that you have to find on the specific turn, especially with no Lele in format as well. If we had a Lele in format, I think this would be a little bit more of a justifiable 2-star, 3-star area, but we have no real way of searching this, so you have to dig towards it or Eldegoss it, and for a supporter effect, it's just not strong enough.
Yeah, I think exactly right. Straight away, we're only looking at the VMAXs. Eternatus obviously can't play Eldegoss, so one Phoebe won't be enough in your deck, therefore it's probably not worth multiple spaces. The Fire decks can already play Reshizard, like you said, or just Volks. If you are going to be using Single Strike, it already naturally wall breaks, so the only VMAXs I could think of was like Rapid Strike Urshifu and Inteleon. The good news is, if you are playing one Phoebe and one Eldegoss, that should be enough to win you the game, because it's more than two uses of Phoebe, because you can float up and put that back into your deck. Like you said, Decidueye and Zama, they do such poor damage that you could just spend turns attaching to Eldegoss, float up, and eventually re-establish that Phoebe as well. So yeah, it could be, a one-card include that could get you like 3 wall breaks potentially, as long as you're already playing Eldegoss. But I think there are probably better ways. I remember Inteleon sometimes played like Suicune. You could do that again. And Rapid Strike probably has some other attackers. Obviously, against Zamazenta, they can try and use Empoleon, stuff like that. So I think there will be better ways around it than including Phoebe overall. Next up, we have Tower of Darkness. It's the stadium card that we've already alluded to a couple of times. It's a single strike stadium that says, once during each player's turn, that player may discard a single strike card from their hand and draw 2 cards. It's very similar to Scorched Earth, which was a fairly well-used stadium in its time for a number of decks, but it's actually got a ton more targets than Scorched Earth ever would have. Even like aggressive blacksmithing fire decks, they probably only played like 13 or so energy cards in a lot of situations, whereas Tower of Darkness, it's going to have, in the single strike Urshifu deck, it's going to have 16 Pokemon up to, and then it's got 4 special energy, the number of stadiums you have, the number of jars you have as well. So you're looking at over a third of your deck is going to be targets for Tower of Darkness. So that's going to be live. As long as there's not a swell in play, Tower of Darkness is going to be ticking away and drawing you cards in a ton of different hands. And I think that's just excellent. Single Strike Urshi is a big setup deck. You're trying to make combos happen in your opening turns, even going first. You want to establish Hound Hours and stuff like that. And Tower of Darkness can give you some additional draws, which I think is a really, really big deal for the deck. So again, I'm kind of concerned by the consistency of Single Strike Urshi, but one thing really going in its favor is that Tower of Darkness, which I think is going to be fantastic. We've also talked about Primeape and how they'll play Bruno as well, so even more targets for you, which is nice. And, because you're playing one prize decks, in theory, the game will go longer, so you have more turns to use the value of Tower of Darkness as well, so that's another thing going for it. I think the only real competition for Urshifu is that you may want to play Dojo if you want to have a G-Max one-blow push on every single VMAX in the game. I think already you can expect to have probably 2, sometimes 3 single strike energies attached to you at any one time, and the Dojo could be a way for you to push over to that 320 realm, which could be relevant for some certain Pokemon. Obviously, things like Centiskorch come to mind straight away. So that's the only competition for Tower of Darkness, but I think this one draws cards, so I'm interested, essentially.
Next up, we have Tower of Waters, equally a very, very strong stadium for the Rapid Strike decks. The Tower of Water reduces the retreat cost of your Rapid Strike Pokemon by 2, which is basically giving them all free retreat. I don't think there's any Rapid Strike Pokemon we've seen so far that have a retreat cost of higher than 3, because that's just not in their nature. These are meant to be sort of fast-paced attackers, so that makes sense. and therefore giving all of your Pokemon free retreat is fantastic. We saw how successful Sky Arrow Bridge was in certain archetypes, and that was -1 retreat, which kind of limited the amount of Pokemon that could make use out of it. Whereas this is basically your whole Rapid Strike package. So you basically only need one switch to reset Gale Thrust. You only need a Tower of Water to basically have free retreat on anything. You don't need to play a huge amount of air balloons. Obviously, air balloons stick on the board more than a Tower of Water, so you may want to play a couple anyway, but it means there's less reliance. Maybe you can get away with playing some of these more niche tools like Telescopic Sight. And obviously, this is searchable with Rapid Strike search on Octillery as well, which is just fantastic. So it makes it a tutorable, basically switch at any point that can pretty much go on as long as it stays in play, which is just obviously great. It really fits in with the sort of flavor of all of these Rapid Strike Pokemon. Empoleon switches energy to the bench, so you can then free retreat into the Pokemon that you've moved the energy onto, attach. It's probably going to be an Urshifu, let's be realistic here, and just go for a Gmax Rapid Flow from having, no real threat on the board the turn prior. So yeah, obviously this, like I say, is huge in flavor for the kind of flexibility that these decks are going to want to have, and I think it's just going to pay dividends in these kind of decks. Again, similarly, the only real competition is probably going to be Martial Arts Dojo, but because Rapid Flow snipes the bench, it's sort of a little bit less like your less of a competition, I think, than even the Tower of Darkness. And I think already Tower of Darkness was better than Martial Arts Dojo in most scenarios anyway. But because Gmax Rapid Flow deals damage to the bench, a lot of the time you wouldn't even be getting the benefit out of Martial Arts Dojo because it only does the buff to the active. So yeah, I think Tower of Water is another fantastic stadium for the format in terms of these Rapid Strike decks, and it fits in with the theme perfectly.
Let's move on to the special energy then. We've already alluded to both of these a little bit, but the Rapid Strike energy is just completely bananas. It can only be attached to Rapid Strike Pokemon, of course, but it provides a water and fighting energy, and both at the same time. So think of double dragon energy for those dragon types. Now it's exactly for the Rapid Strikers, and suddenly all of these attack costs that you've been worrying about become a lot less troublesome. Like I said, these cards, thanks to their one colorless in their attack costs, means they're opened up to even more acceleration than that as well. So we've tried out builds with Welder, we've tried out builds with Tapu Koko Prism Star, we've tried out Karate Belt for the Urshifu at least. And yeah, there's a ton of ways you can get rolling with these guys thanks to just one attachment of that Rapid Strike energy. That energy is searchable for Octillery as well, so you're never missing a beat with some broken energy attachments as well. So this card is just crazy good, insane efficiency for exactly these two cards essentially as attackers right now in the game, and obviously the regular Urshifu V. And essentially it just makes Rapid Flow a chainable, ridiculous threat. Really reminds me of Garchomp C back in the SP era, where you would just attach an energy gain and a DC and it would be ready to do a ridiculous 80 damage snipe at the time. Shows you how far we've come, that now it's doing 120 in two directions. But yeah, extremely efficient, makes all of these attackers far more dangerous and bursty in certain situations as well. Searchable through Octillery or Celebi, and yeah, I mean, absolutely crazy power level. And if you're worried about hammers as well, a lot of the time Urshifu discards it from itself regardless, so limited to that 4, fortunately. But yeah, just really, really insane.
Definitely. It feels like this is as strong as like a double rainbow or whatever. It's so strong. And also, like you say, you can see the difference between kind of, well, you'll see when we take a look at the single strike energy, how they've lent to these two different archetypes, two different directions that I think are both incredibly strong. But I think just we saw how strong Double Dragon Energy was. DCE hasn't been reprinted basically because that was too strong and that was too colorless energy. This is too colored energy. So just putting that into perspective is absolutely bonkers. And it, like you say, it means Gmax Rapid Flow essentially is basically online any turn as of turn 1. As soon as you get a Urshifu V down, you are going to have to start thinking about can they Rapid Flow next turn, and I don't think there'll be many situations where they can't, to be honest. So yeah, I think this is potentially one of the best cards, if not the best card in the set. And yeah, it's just absolutely bonkers. And finally, we have the counterpart, Single Strike Energy, again, notching it down to a 4-star basically because we think in general the Single Strike decks are going to be slightly worse than the Rapid Strike decks, but still obviously phenomenal. I've mentioned this before, but it's basically, it can only be attached to Single Strike Pokemon, and it provides a Dark or a Fighting, but only one at a time, and you do an extra 20 damage. So it's basically Strong Energy, but also a Dark type energy, which is obviously brilliant for trying to reach some of these higher HP numbers that we're seeing right now, especially when you've already got a base of 270 on Urshifu. You only need one or two of these to start knocking out VMAXs with no real issue. So that's pretty impressive. Given that it's searchable and attachable via Houndoom, that obviously just buffs the card even more. Any energy acceleration is already good, but when it's special energy acceleration that also increases damage, it's just mind-boggling that like that's even a thing. That's crazy. Obviously, you can reset them with reshuffle them in with the jar and reattach them. But it even makes things like Tyranitar V and Single Strike Urshifu, sort of the baby, actually like viable threats, given that they typically perhaps would just be seen as fodder. The Single Strike Urshifu just does 3 for 180, which is crazy that kind of wouldn't be enough these days. But now that it's 3 for 180, but potentially more, you can be two-shotting a lot of these VMAXs, obviously, but you can also be one-shotting a lot of V Pokemon with a couple of these, which is really impressive. And similarly, Tyranitar V does a healthy 240 for 4. Well, with a couple of these, you're up to 280, knocking out tag teams, which is quite impressive. Obviously, things are a little bit more awkward for Tyranitar because it's 4 energy to only reach tag teams, whereas if you just evolved a Single Strike Hershey, you'd be reaching VMAXs. So there's a little bit of anti-synergy there, but even so, like the fact that we can talk about all of these archetypes based on the fact that this energy exists is just shows how strong it is. Like I say, we've dropped it to a 4 just because in our testing it's turned out that we've both been more impressed with the Rapid Strike decks than the Single Strike decks. But I can completely see why people think this is a 5-star card, because I'm pretty sure Strong Energy was a 5-star card, and this also provides Dark type energy. So it's like a buffed Strong Energy in almost all scenarios. I guess it can't be attached to any fighting Pokemon, but right now the fighting Pokemon you want to be attaching to, these are some of the best fighting Pokemon we've had in a long time. And it looks like we're getting support for these Pokemon for a long time coming. So yeah, very, very exciting card. And I think even though we're rating it slightly lower in the community and we're saying that Single Strike will probably peak at around a tier 2 archetype, this is definitely going to be a threatening card in the future, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, really.
Yeah, I mean, we already have powerful colorless energy in the format, and that's not turning the world on fire at all, is it? It's not doing anything. It depends what deck it can go into, and we're saying this won't be the top tier contender of the format. We think it'll be in and around. But what I do love about the Single Strike energy is that it means that you can fight on all those sorts of fronts. You can be a 2-prize v2 prize because the damage buff turns Single Strike Urshi into something that can pump out 220, 230 damage quite easily. Houndoom with 2 energies, because of it fulfilling Dark type, means you can hit 90 damage. So any of these level ballable 1-prize decks like Mad Party and Whimsicott, Houndoom can be chipping in and doing Darkness Fans to do 1-for-1 trades. And if you're into other VMAX matchups, that GMAX 1-blow can one-hit KO a lot of them. Obviously, type coverage means you're going to be destroying Eternatus in one hit, but you can reach that 300-odd number if you're committing a ton of Single Strike energies as well. So it really does buff all of those numbers into ridiculous realms. And that's really going to summarize the trainer part of this set review. Like we said, we're also going to be doing a V and VMAX section, as well as a 1-prize / no rule box Pokemon section as well. So we'll be having a little pause here. Here is going to be the summary for all of these supporters, trainers, tools, special energy, and stadium cards. To pause now if you really want to just get the scoop and remind yourselves of our ratings.
And we also have broken them down into the Omnipoke 1 to 5 stars and the community 1 to 5 stars. So you can see like the differences between the community and us. Typically, the community are rating rate cards higher than we do, but this time we've rated a whole 8 cards 4-star. So that's going to be interesting to see. it's like we say, there's usually a bit of disparity between the community and us. Usually, we're a little bit more pessimistic, I guess. So I think hopefully that brings about great things for this set, because it means that maybe if even we're happy, maybe the cards are like crazy good. I don't know. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see, and obviously some great reprints, some great engines in general, and really not that many sort of bad cards. I think there were, well, you can see there's only there's only 4 1-star cards for us, which is also typically quite low for us. So yeah, very, very hopeful for the trainers and supporters in this set. And that also carries through to the Pokemon as well. This is a really, really exciting set. Definitely going to shake up the metagame. So yeah, I'm really looking forward not only to the trainers, of course, but I think the trainers are going to be very, very impactful when the set's released.
Thanks so much for watching then, guys. Let us know your favorite full art trainer of the set. Which ones are you going to pick up? These are some of our favorites, and let us know if you disagree or agree with any of our ratings. And make sure you stick around over the next couple of days on the channel. We will be doing the V and V Maxes as well as the one prize Pokemon, so make sure you check them out. Thanks so much for watching, and see you then.